Historical censorship is a phenomenon that permeates the history of humanity, especially when we talk about mythology. Since ancient times, many stories have been carefully edited or even completely silenced, usually for reasons involving morality, religion, or politics. I believe we have all heard of mythologies that, at first glance, seem to be simple stories of gods and heroes. However, upon closer inspection, we realize that some of these stories contain elements that, if revealed, could cause great uproar in societies. For example, in many cultures, there were stories about gods who behaved in questionable ways, committing acts of violence and betrayal. These stories, because they were considered immoral, were altered or omitted over time. It is interesting to note that a story that could offer a more complete view of human nature was distorted to fit ideals that were more palatable to society. This raises an important question. To what extent does censorship shape our understanding of what is acceptable and what is not? Furthermore, tales involving taboo relationships, such as incest between gods and mortals, were often left out so as not to shock the morals of the time. Throughout history, these stories were seen as something that could destabilize the social fabric. Therefore, it is understandable that, in the search for a more moral society, the narratives were altered. However, in doing so, we lost a significant part of the richness and complexity of interpretations that mythology can offer. It is interesting to reflect on how these censorships shaped our perception of deities and myths. For example, when we read stories of gods who make mistakes, it is possible to see a reflection on human nature, which also makes mistakes and learns over time. This connection between divine and human failures could teach us a lot about empathy and understanding. But this lesson is often lost due to censorship. Talking about historical censorship is not just an academic exercise, it is an invitation to reflection. We as a society must consider whether our own narratives are being shaped by external pressures. Could it be that by censoring certain stories, we are also censoring our understanding of ourselves? The answer may be more complex than it seems. The impact of historical censorship on mythology is profound, and continuing this conversation is essential. In recent years, we have seen a growing movement to revisit these stories that have been silenced. Authors and scholars are seeking to bring to light narratives that challenge norms and that truly reflect the complexity of human morality. This revival is vital, as it allows us not only to re-examine the past, but also to better understand the present. Thus, as we reflect on historical censorship, we are called to consider not only what has been lost, but what can still be recovered. Each story we dare to explore offers us a new perspective on life, morality, and most importantly, on ourselves. It is a journey worth taking, filled with lessons that, though ancient, remain relevant in our quest for self-understanding and spiritual growth. Mythology, with its rich and complex stories, often presents gods who are not exactly paragons of virtue. When we read these narratives, we come across divine characters who commit acts that, from today's perspective, would be considered immoral. These stories show us that even supreme beings, with powers beyond human comprehension, can behave in questionable ways. This leads us to reflect on the duality of the divine nature and the human condition. In many cultures, we find gods who indulge in violence, betrayal, and even deceit. For example, in Greek mythology, Zeus, the king of the gods, did not hesitate to use his strength and cunning to get what he wanted. He often disguised himself or manipulated mortals to satisfy his whims, which raises the question, how can we accept such behavior in entities that should be exemplary? This is a question that, over the centuries, has generated heated debate. Personally, I have always been intrigued by the idea that the gods, in their stories, reflect human weaknesses. This makes us think that perhaps morality is not such a clear line between good and evil. We often find deities who not only commit acts of violence, but also engage in romantic intrigues that unfold in scenarios of betrayal and jealousy. These narratives, when censored, fail to show us the complexity of human emotions and relationships, hiding a fundamental part of what it means to be human. Furthermore, the omission of these immoral stories of the gods can be seen as an attempt to protect the morality of society. By presenting divine figures as perfect, we create an expectation that we should behave in a similar way. However, this expectation can be unrealistic, since all of us at some point have made mistakes or acted in ways that we would not like to be exposed. The immoral behavior of gods in mythologies also questions the social norms that we follow. When we look at these censored stories, we realize that they are a mirror of the flaws and dilemmas that we face in our own lives. By recognizing that even the most powerful beings have their weaknesses, we find a space for acceptance of our own imperfections. This is liberating. After all, we are all human beings, and fallibility is an intrinsic part of the human condition. It is important to highlight that, despite their flaws, the gods also teach us about redemption, love, and even forgiveness. In many narratives, even the most terrible deities are capable of learning and transformation. This teaches us a valuable lesson. Morality is not static, but rather a path that we can follow, full of setbacks. In short, the censorship of stories that show the gods engaging in immoral behavior is not just a question of morality, but an opportunity to reflect on ourselves. By re-examining these narratives, we can find not only a deeper understanding of mythology, but also a space to embrace our own complexities. After all, we are always in some way part of this great tapestry that is the human experience. When we talk about mythology, it is impossible to ignore the complexity of the relationships between gods and mortals. These interactions, which often involve forbidden or incestuous love, have often been omitted or softened in the most accepted versions of the stories. This is due to a need to adapt the narratives to the moral standards of society at each time. However, in doing so, we lose the depth and richness of these stories that reflect not only the culture of a time, but also universal aspects of the human condition. A classic example comes from Greek mythology, where many gods, such as Zeus and Aphrodite, engage in complicated and often morally questionable relationships. Zeus, the king of the gods, did not hesitate to seduce mortals, often resulting in incestuous relationships with his own daughters or sisters. These stories have often been downplayed or reinterpreted over the centuries, partly to protect society's morality and partly to avoid scandal. However, by excluding these narratives, we run the risk of simplifying our understanding of the deities and their desires. Personally, when I read about these relationships, I feel a deep connection to human reality. These myths, although they involve gods, speak to the dilemmas and pains that we all face. Attraction, betrayal, and forbidden love are universal themes that resonate in our lives. In a society that often condemns what it does not understand, it is fascinating to see how these stories have been shaped to fit into a box that often does not reflect the true essence of the human experience. In addition to reflecting the morality of the time, these taboo relationships also reveal the power of storytelling. In ancient cultures, storytelling was a way to transmit knowledge, values, and warnings. The taboo surrounding certain relationships reinforces the idea that morality is, in many cases, a social construct that varies according to the historical context. When we look at these censored narratives, we realize that they not only challenge norms, but also invite us to reflect on our own prejudices and limitations. The censorship of these stories is not only a question of morality, but a reflection of how society sees itself. By omitting these relationships, we create a more simplistic view of the gods and life. The truth is that the imperfections and conflicts of the deities, as well as our own are what make these narratives so fascinating and relevant. They show us that, regardless of whether we are a god or a mortal, we are all susceptible to passions, mistakes, and regrets. Recently, I have noticed a growing movement to re-examine these stories that have been left out. Contemporary authors and filmmakers are venturing into bringing these complexities to the surface, allowing audiences to explore the fullness of human experience, unfiltered by censorship. This allows us not only to better understand the ancient narratives, but also to rethink our own conceptions of love, morality, and the nuances of being human. In short, taboo relationships in mythology are an invitation to delve deeply into the human condition. They teach us that morality is often more complex than it seems, and they encourage us to embrace the fullness of experience with all its implications, as its shadows and lights. By exploring these stories, we are challenged to look at ourselves and question what we really know about love, desire, and humanity. Mythology is full of places that carry sacred meaning, where rituals and ceremonies were performed to please the gods. Many of these traditions include elements that, at first glance, may seem strange or even shocking by contemporary standards. One of the most controversial aspects of these rituals is the practice of human sacrifice, which, in many ancient cultures, was seen as a form of direct communication with the divine. When I think about this, it is easy to feel a certain aversion. The idea of offering one's life in exchange for divine favors or protection may sound extremely cruel and unthinkable. However, it is important to place ourselves in the historical and cultural context of the time. For the societies that practiced such rituals, the belief that the gods demanded sacrifices to ensure the prosperity and security of their community was deeply rooted. Human sacrifice, in fact, was often considered an act of great devotion and love. The ancients did not see this as a crime, but as a sacred duty. If we look at the practices of civilizations such as the Aztecs, for example, we see that performing sacrifices was not only common, but also celebrated. The Aztecs believed that the sun needed energy from human blood to continue its journey across the sky. Thus, sacrificing a warrior or a prisoner was seen as a way to ensure the continuity of life and the cycle of the seasons. On the other hand, the Romans also had their own rituals, which involved the offering of animals and, in some cases, humans, to appease the gods and ensure the well-being of the city. However, as societies evolved, many of these practices began to be viewed with disapproval. Morality changed, and so did views on life and death. Thus, the stories that celebrated these rituals were largely silenced. It is interesting to see how the censorship of these narratives not only erased stories, but also prevented generations from understanding the complexity of the relationship between humans and the divine. Even today, when we reflect on these rituals, we are led to question our own morality. What is acceptable in the name of faith? To what extent are we willing to sacrifice something or someone for a greater ideal? These questions, although they may seem distant, resonate deeply in our daily lives. Each of us has our own sacrifices, be they emotional, spiritual, or even physical, that we make for love, faith, or conviction. Today, interest in these censored narratives is resurfacing. Literature, cinema, and even the visual arts have brought these stories to light, inviting us to revisit what has been forgotten or omitted. This re-evaluation allows us to understand the nuances of human nature, the duality between good and evil, and how the search for divine approval can lead us to extremes. Therefore, when we explore the sacred places and sacrifices in the stories of mythology, we are invited to reflect on our own beliefs and values. What do these narratives teach us about humanity and our relationship with the sacred? It is an invitation to look within and understand that, regardless of the era, moral and spiritual dilemmas continue to accompany us. Alternative versions of mythological narratives further show us the complexity of morality. Each culture adapts its stories to reflect its norms and values. By analyzing these variations, I realize that morality is not an absolute truth, but a set of interpretations that can change depending on the cultural context. This teaches us to have empathy and to understand that what may be right for one group may be wrong for another. Recently, the movement to revive these censored stories has gained momentum. It is a unique opportunity to re-examine the narratives that have shaped our understanding of the world. By bringing these complexities to light, we are invited to reflect on our own moralities and to question the norms we follow. This process of re-evaluation is fundamental for our personal and collective growth, as it allows us to learn from the past and, who knows, create a more conscious and just future. Ultimately, the discussion of morality through mythology is not just a reflection on what is right or wrong. It is an invitation to introspection, to the understanding that we are all flawed and that, just like the gods, our choices shape the society in which we live. Through these stories, we find a way to better understand ourselves and the world around us.